The morning Sylvie Beaumont packed her single trunk. Her father was already drunk. It was 6 in the morning, the kind of cold that bit through the walls of their small house on the edge of Rivière du Loup. And Bernard Fortin, she caught herself. That wasn't the name she was supposed to think of anymore. Her father. She would just call him her father, because he didn't deserve the weight of being named. He sat at the kitchen table with a glass of something amber and didn't look up when she carried her trunk past him and set it by the door. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't say he was sorry. He said, "Remy Gault is a decent man. You could do worse." Sylvie was 22 years old, and she had never met Remy Gault in her life. She'd heard things, the way you hear things in a small town, that he lived far up the Laurentian Ridge past the last paved road, in a house that took 5 hours to reach by truck when the weather was good and longer when it wasn't, that his wife had died 2 winters ago, leaving him with 4 children and a farm that was already stretched thin. That he was not a cruel man. People said this carefully, the way you say it when you are trying to leave room for what you're not saying. Her father had arranged it over a handshake and a debt. She found out later that Remy Gault had paid off 3 months of what her father owed to a man in town. 3 months of whiskey and cards, settled in exchange for a daughter. Sylvie did not learn this on the morning she left. She learned it months later, alone in a kitchen at the top of the world, and by then she had already decided it didn't matter. By then she had already decided that she was not going to let that be the whole story. But on the morning she left, she only knew that she had nowhere else to go. She had no mother. She had no sisters. She had a cousin in Montreal who had her own 3 children and a 1-bedroom apartment, and had looked at Sylvie over the phone with the particular exhaustion of someone who loves you but cannot hold you. She had skills. She could cook, she could sew. She had finished 2 years of college before the money ran out. She could read a room and she could work, and she did not cry easily. She was carrying all of this with her up the mountain. The truck that came for her belonged to a neighbor of Remy's, a broad-shouldered older man named Gilles, who said almost nothing for the first 3 hours of the drive, and then, somewhere past the second unpaved turn, said, "He's not a bad man, you know. He's not been right since Annette died." None of them have. Sylvie looked out at the trees closing in on either side of the road. "How old are the children?" "Oldest is 14. Boy named Callum." "Wait, no." Gilles frowned at the windshield. "The oldest is the girl, 15. Her name is Juniper. Then Callum. Then the twins, they're 8. She didn't ask anything else. She watched the road turn from gravel to dirt to something that was barely a track at all, and she thought about a 15-year-old girl who had lost her mother and was about to gain a stranger in her place, and she felt for the first time genuinely afraid. Not of Remy Gault, of the girl. She was right to be. The house was bigger than she expected, which was not saying much. It was a real farmhouse, wide and low, built from logs and thyme, with a porch that sagged on the left side and firewood stacked along the entire north wall. There was a barn set back behind it, and fields beyond that, and then the ridge rising up steep and dark with spruce and fir. The sky above was the kind of pale winter blue that looks beautiful and means nothing except cold. Remy Gault came out to the porch when the truck pulled up. He was taller than she'd imagined, dark-haired, going gray at the temples, with a face that had been weathered into something blunt and careful. He looked at her the way you look at weather, assessing, not unkind, but not warm either. He shook her hand. His palm was rough as bark. "I appreciate you coming," he said, which struck her as a strange thing to say, since they both knew she hadn't exactly had a choice. She said, "I appreciate the welcome," and he blinked at that just slightly, and she saw something shift behind his eyes. Not warmth. More like recalibration. The children were another story. Juniper did not come out to meet her. Sylvie saw the curtain move in the upstairs window and caught one flash of a pale face before it disappeared. Callum came and stood on the porch with his arms crossed and his chin up, 13 years old, and trying very hard to look like someone you would not want to argue with. He looked at Sylvie's trunk like it was an invasion. He looked at Sylvie like she was the one who'd arranged all of this herself for her own benefit, at his personal expense. The twins, a boy and a girl named Theo and Blythe, were different. They hung back behind their father and stared at her with huge, solemn eyes, and when she crouched down to be at their level and said hello, Blythe put her thumb in her mouth, and Theo said very seriously, "Are you going to sleep in Mama's room?" The silence that followed was enormous. Remy said, "No," very quickly. Sylvie has her own room. That first week was the longest of her life. She cooked, she cleaned, she learned where everything was by opening drawers and cabinets quietly, like someone trying not to disturb a sleeping animal, because that was what the house felt like. A creature that was injured and needed not to be startled. She did the laundry. She brought in firewood. She fixed a hinge on the kitchen cupboard that had been hanging loose, long enough that the wood around the screw had split. And she did this with a kit she found in the barn, and nobody told her to, and nobody thanked her for it. Juniper refused to speak to her for 11 days. Not ignoring her, exactly. It was more deliberate than that. Juniper would leave a room when Sylvie entered it. Would answer Sylvie's questions with a single syllable or a look that said everything without saying anything at all. She was 15 and she had her mother's photograph on her dresser. Sylvie had seen it once through an open door, a laughing woman with dark eyes. And she understood. She understood completely. She wasn't angry at Juniper. She was careful around her, like you are careful around something that has every right to bite you. Callum was more direct about it. On the 4th day, he left a live frog in her boot. On the 7th day, he accidentally knocked a full pot of water off the stove while she was cooking. And it wasn't hot enough to burn her, but it soaked through her sock, and she stood there for a moment in the mess of it, cold water spreading across the floor, and looked at him, and he looked back at her, daring her to react in exactly the way he expected. She crouched down and started mopping up the water with the rag from the hook by the sink, and she said, "Can you get the mop from the porch closet?" Not a question, just a direction. And there was enough calm in her voice that it confused him. He got the mop. He didn't apologize. She didn't ask him to. Remy was home most days, but he existed in the house the way a storm exists at a distance. Present, felt, but not quite touching anything. He worked from before dawn until dark, and came in for meals and ate with the particular concentration of someone who has learned to live entirely in the physical. He was not rude to her. He asked how her day had gone a few times, and listened to her answers with genuine attention, which surprised her. But there was a wall somewhere behind his eyes, and she didn't push against it because she didn't have the right yet. And she wasn't sure she wanted to. At night, she lay in her small room under the eave and listened to the wind off the ridge and thought about her cousin's apartment in Montreal, and then stopped thinking about it because that way led somewhere she couldn't afford to go. The twins warmed to her by the end of the 2nd week, which she hadn't expected and which almost undid her. Theo began following her around the kitchen when she cooked, not helping, just watching, with the intense silent curiosity of a small scientist. Blythe started leaving things outside her door. Once a pine cone, once a drawing of what was either a cat or a very abstract horse, once a single wrapped candy that had clearly been saved from somewhere and was slightly lint-covered. Sylvie kept all of them. She kept them on the windowsill of her room where she could see them. It was Blythe who got sick. It came on fast, the way illness does in children, fine in the morning and burning up by noon. Remy was out on the back acreage checking the fence line before the next freeze, far enough that Callum had run to get him, but it would take time, maybe an hour. Juniper stood in the doorway of Blythe's room with her arms wrapped around herself, 15 years old and terrified in a way she was trying very hard not to show, because she had already watched one person she loved go from fine to not fine, and she knew what that could mean. Sylvie didn't hesitate. She ran cold water on cloths and laid them on Blythe's forehead and the back of her neck. She made ginger tea with honey and got it into her in small sips. She sat on the edge of the bed and held the child's hand and talked to her, steadily, about nothing in particular, about the river down below the ridge, about the way the snow looked on the spruce trees in the morning, about a cat she'd had as a girl named something ridiculous that she couldn't even remember now. The details didn't matter. Only the voice mattered, only staying present and steady so that Blythe could feel steadiness. The fever peaked late in the afternoon, the kind of peak where a child's eyes go glassy and they stop responding quite normally. And Sylvie felt the fear move through her in one clean cold wave, and she pushed through it. She kept the compresses cool. She kept talking. She got more tea into her. She watched the clock and she counted breaths, and she did not leave the room. Juniper brought her a glass of water at some point, set it on the bedside table without a word, and stood in the corner. Not leaving. Just standing. Sylvie didn't acknowledge it out loud. She just kept doing what she was doing. And Juniper stood there in the corner, and after a while Juniper slid down the wall and sat on the floor, and that was how Remy found them when he came in. Sylvie on the bed, Juniper on the floor, Blythe breathing easier, the worst of it starting to pass. He stood in the doorway for a long moment. He didn't say anything. He came and he checked his daughter's forehead with the back of his hand, and his whole body released something. Some held tension Sylvie hadn't even fully realized he was carrying. And then he looked at Sylvie and she expected gratitude, but what she got was something more complicated. Something that looked like a man who had just been shown something about himself that he hadn't known was possible. That someone could walk into his wreck of a life and hold it steady without being asked. He said, "Go eat something." That was all. But the way he said it was different from anything he had said to her before. It was the way you speak to someone who is yours to care about. She went downstairs and made herself a bowl of soup and sat at the kitchen table alone and looked at her hands for a long time. After that, something shifted. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. It was the kind of shift that happens the way ice goes out in spring, invisibly for a long time, and then all at once you notice the river is moving again. Juniper spoke to her first on a Tuesday morning, 2 days after Blythe's fever broke. Sylvie was braiding Blythe's hair at the kitchen table and struggling with a section that kept slipping loose, and Juniper appeared beside her, didn't say anything for a moment, and then said, "You have to start the braid higher, closer to the part," and took over in a matter-of-fact way, as if this were simply a mechanical problem that needed solving, not a gesture of enormous significance. Sylvie stepped back and let her, and didn't make anything of it, and that was apparently the right call, because Juniper kept talking small things, practical things, and by the end of the week they were having real conversations. Careful ones, but real. Callum held out longer. He was a boy who had made up his mind and didn't see why he should unmake it. But there came a night in late November when Sylvie found him in the barn at 10 o'clock at night, in the cold, sitting with the older of their 2 horses, who had been spooked by something and wouldn't settle. Sylvie had gone out because she'd heard the horse, and she found Callum there already, just sitting with him, and she sat down too, on the other side of the stall, and they didn't talk, they just sat there in the smell of hay and horse, until the animal calmed down, which took about 40 minutes. When they got up to go back inside, Callum said, "He doesn't like loud noises, especially since last winter." She said, "I'll remember that." He nodded and went inside ahead of her. But the next morning he passed her the salt at breakfast without being asked, and she understood that this was his version of an apology, and she accepted it exactly as it was given. Remy was harder to read, and she wasn't trying to read him, not exactly. She had made herself stop doing that early on, the measuring and calculating, because it made her feel like something worse than she was. She was here. She was useful. She was trying to build something real out of this strange circumstance. Whether he saw it that way, whether he felt anything about it, that was not her project. But the evening started to change. In the beginning, after dinner, he had retreated to the office where he did his accounts, or sat alone on the porch regardless of temperature. By December, he was staying at the kitchen table longer after the children went up. Not talking much, but there. He read sometimes. She read sometimes. Theo had started leaving his drawings on the table between them. Critiques requested of both parties, and this gave them something to look at together and comment on, which was easier than looking at each other. She learned things about him the way you learn things when you're paying attention without meaning to. He had grown up not far from where she had, further south near Trois-Rivières. He had come up to the ridge 20 years ago with Annette, and they had built this together, all of it. The house and the farm and the life, and he had not been back to town much since she died, not really, because the town reminded him of a version of himself that no longer existed. He learned things about her too. She could tell when he had filed something away. A slight change in how he looked at her the next time the subject came up. She told him once about her college courses, what she'd been studying, and the following week he came in from town with a second-hand book on the same subject that he'd found at the library sale, and he put it on the kitchen table without ceremony, without even making eye contact, just left it there for her to find. She stood looking at that book for a long time before she picked it up. December came fully down on the ridge like a fist closing, the kind of cold that goes past discomfort into something that requires you to be purposeful about surviving it. The children went to school through snowdrifts by snowmobile and came back red-faced and loud and brought the outside cold in with them. The house was small and full and alive in a way that Sylvie hadn't expected, hadn't even let herself imagine in those first silent days. She started teaching Juniper to cook properly. Not just following recipes, but understanding how flavors built on each other, how heat and time changed things. The kind of cooking that is also a way of understanding how the world works. Juniper was sharp and quick to learn, and critical in the way that smart people are critical, which Sylvie respected. She started helping Callum with his homework in the evenings, which he accepted with the minimum possible acknowledgement, but he kept coming back, which was what mattered. The twins were simply hers now, in the uncomplicated way that young children attach to people who are consistently kind to them, and she let herself feel that without guilt. She did not let herself feel the other thing without guilt, not yet. It was a night in January when the other thing became something she could no longer entirely manage. The temperature had dropped to something unreal, the kind of cold that the radio talks about with genuine alarm, and they had all stayed close to the woodstove all day. The children and Sylvie playing cards and doing puzzles and doing the indoor work that a farm always has. And at some point in the evening, Remy had come and sat down at the table and played cards with them, which he almost never did. And Theo had climbed into his lap and fallen asleep there. And Remy had just let him, kept his cards in one hand and the sleeping child against his chest with the other. And the look on his face was something that Sylvie saw for only a moment before she looked away. She looked away because it would not have been right to keep looking. Because what was on his face in that moment was grief and love so tangled together they were the same thing. And it was private, and it was not hers. But she felt it. She felt the whole weight of it, what this man was carrying, what he had been carrying alone for 2 years, and something in her chest did something that she didn't have clean words for. She excused herself early and went upstairs and sat on her bed in the cold dark for a while. March broke eventually, the way March in Quebec breaks, grudgingly. Then all at once, the snow went soft. The trees started their tentative leafing, just the faintest green haze on the birches first. The ridge opened up again. There was mud everywhere for 3 weeks and everyone was irritable, and then the mud dried and the world came back. Sylvie started running in the mornings. Not because she'd been a runner before, she hadn't, but because the ridge in the morning in early spring was something she didn't have language for yet. The light and the cold air and the silence, the world waking up around her, and she needed it the way you need things that put you back in your own body. Remy saw her come back one morning, red-faced and breathing hard, and he said from the porch where he was drinking his coffee, "The trail on the north side is better. Less ice this time of year." She said, "Show me sometime." He said, "All right," and looked at his coffee, and she went inside, and neither of them mentioned it again for 2 weeks. And then one Saturday morning in April he appeared at the kitchen door in his boots and said, "Trail," and she was ready in 5 minutes. They ran, or he ran, and she ran. And they weren't quite together, but they weren't separate either, along the North Ridge Trail for an hour. And they didn't talk much, but it didn't need talking. The trail was exactly what he'd said it would be, better, wider, with views that opened up through the trees every so often like a door someone had left ajar on purpose. She thought once, running and looking out at the valley below, the river still high with meltwater, the whole enormous landscape laid out quiet and enormous, she thought, "I did not choose this and I would choose it now." She didn't say that, but she thought it. It was Juniper who said something first, which Sylvie would not have predicted. Juniper, who had been watchful all winter, taking everything in with those dark, careful eyes, who had slowly become something like a friend without either of them naming it. In May, sitting on the porch after dinner, just the two of them, she said, "Dad laughs more, you know, than before." Sylvie said, "That's good." Juniper said, "Yeah." And then after a pause, "You're not leaving, are you? Like you're going to stay?" Sylvie thought about her answer for a real moment. Of not performing the thinking, actually thinking. She looked out at the ridge going golden in the evening light, at the barn, at Theo running after the barn cats in the yard, at this thing that had been none of her making and had somehow become hers anyway. She said, "I'm staying." Juniper nodded, as if this confirmed something she already decided. "Good," she said. "The twins would be impossible if you left. Like genuinely unbearable." The summer that followed was the kind of summer that you recognize later as the time when your life took its actual shape. There was work, there is always work on a farm in summer, and the children home from school and underfoot and loud and necessary, and the long evenings that go blue and slow in the way northern summer evenings do. She learned the farm. She learned what the soil needed and what it didn't, what the animals needed, when to ask Remy and when to figure it out herself. She learned the ridge in every kind of weather. She and Remy had a conversation one evening in late June that was neither of them saying what they were saying. The particular kind of conversation where the actual thing is spoken entirely in the pauses. He was fixing the porch railing. She was sitting on the step. He said something about the price of feed, and she said something back, and then neither of them said anything for a while. And in the silence something settled between them. Some agreement they hadn't verbalized, some understanding about what this was and where it was going. Later that night he knocked on her door. He said, "I know this isn't what you planned for your life." She said, "I didn't have a plan." He said, I want to know if you're." He stopped. He tried again. "If you wanted to be somewhere else, I'd understand that. I think you know that." She said, "I'm not somewhere else. I'm here." He looked at her for a long moment. His face was doing that thing it sometimes did, where all the careful weathered reserve fell away for just a second, and she could see what was underneath, which was a man who was very tired and very grateful, and very much trying not to hope for something he didn't trust himself to want yet. She said, "Go to sleep, Remy. It's late." He went, and she closed the door and stood with her back against it and let herself feel, completely and without managing it, what she felt. She was still there the following spring when they drove into town on a Saturday morning, all six of them in the truck, the twins arguing in the back, Juniper rolling her eyes at everyone, Callum choosing his battles. The town was the same town that had whispered when she'd arrived, that had looked at Remy Gault's new arrangement with the particular sideways attention of a small place that knows everyone's business, but they had stopped whispering. She had seen to that, not by confronting it, but by simply becoming undeniable, by being there consistently and fully until the fact of her was no longer remarkable. The woman at the feed store said, "Oh, is this the whole family?" and looked at Sylvie when she said it, the way you look at someone you're including. Sylvie said, "All of us." On the way home, Blythe fell asleep against her arm in the back seat, and Sylvie looked out the window at the road rising toward the ridge and didn't try to name what she felt. Some things are better lived than named. Some things you understand not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of all the ordinary ones. The cold mornings and the long evenings, and the sound of the house settling into itself at night. The sound of 4 children breathing in their beds. The weight of a sleeping child against your arm on a road that leads somewhere that is, completely and without any remaining doubt, home.